We tend to think that the world is very large and that we can do within it what we want, and that biology and biophysics and the biosphere will continue to work as it has in the past, that it's large and substantially immune to disturbance. That is absolutely not true. It's being disturbed at the moment. The fact that the Earth is warming as a result of human activities is a really terrifying fact.
We've clearly already seen that the Earth's climate is changing, and almost independent of what we do to limit greenhouse gas emissions, we will still see some additional climate change. So change has already occurred. Some further change is inevitable. What we need to do is to limit that further change.
When you look at the change in temperature in the Canadian Arctic of an expected 5 degrees Celsius, when you look at the changes in rainfall patterns on the prairies of Canada, when you look at the changes that are expected also on the West Coast in terms of snowpack and glacier retreat, it is perfectly clear that if we don't take part in a global process to slow the onset of, indeed, global warming, we are in essentially a suicidal position.
Overall, the climate issue is the most serious environmental, political, and economic issue that I've dealt with in 30 years of public policy. It's not only fascinating, it's very serious, and in many ways it's very dangerous.
We've never had 6 billion people in the world before using all the resources of the Earth to their limits. And now we are diminishing those resources systematically by changing the global environment.
People read every day in the paper about some aspect of this, whether it's a coral incident or dead zones in the oceans or melting ice and no habitat for polar bears in certain areas. And it comes in little packets. And what we've got to do is what we didn't do with the terrorism threat, and that is connect the dots.
We're beginning to see evidence of thinning of sea ice, of diminishing of the ice caps on mountaintops, and other evidence accumulating that the signal of human-caused climate change is beginning to emerge from the noise of natural variation in our weather patterns.
Things are going to continue to worsen as far as climate change is concerned. The question is, how much damage is going to be done before we start getting action on the part of the United States government?
I've said many times it's the single most complicated and single most fascinating issue I think facing the world. It touches everything. And you can't be a serious student of the future of the world. You can't be seriously thinking about how nations get together. You can't seriously think about the survival of biodiversity on the globe. You can't seriously look at just about anything without factoring in issues related to climate change.
Even though we work on this problem all the time, you got to go back to ground zero and really start explaining the basics of the issue. Because if you don't get the basics, then you don't know what to do about it. And in this particular problem, it's a question of understanding that there is a blanket of gases that surrounds the Earth. And when the composition of that blanket is just right, we keep the temperature of the Earth just right. However, if we increase the gases in that blanket, then we're going to heat up the Earth. And the principal gas that we're concerned about is carbon dioxide. And since Americans and the rest of the world became industrialized in the 1800s and thereafter, we started burning fossil fuels, coal, gasoline, oil, and other fossil fuels, either to heat our homes, to provide electricity in power plants, or gasoline in our cars and SUVs to get around. And as we burn those fossil fuels, they give off carbon, and carbon combines with oxygen, and you get carbon dioxide.
A carbon molecule, a CO2 molecule that we release from a tailpipe today stays in the atmosphere for 100 years. So the climate changes we're seeing now are a consequence in large part of the emissions that were made in the 50s and 1960s. Our emissions today are driving the kinds of changes that we will see for 20, 30, 40, 50 years to come.
And so we are now increasing the carbon dioxide in this blanket of gases surrounding the Earth. We've increased it by about 30% over its natural levels, and the more we do that, the warmer it's going to get.
We have already perturbed the climate system beyond the envelope of natural variability, and we know this from measurements of carbon dioxide. we can measure carbon dioxide content in ice cores down in Antarctica, and there are records now that go back 400,000 years, and we know what the natural range of variability is in the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. And we are outside of that limit today.
So this is our freezer. This is where we keep all the ancient ice cores. It's very important to keep it cold, so we have a temperature monitor that just goes all the time, making sure that the cores never get warm. If they get warm, the gases that are trapped in the cores tend to leak out. So now let's go into the freezer here. So this is an ice core. This is what they look like. You can see it's just a nice cylinder of ice. And the amazing thing about these is that they have annual layers in them, usually about an inch thick. Each layer represents 1 year of snow deposition. So when you take a core like this through thousands and thousands of years of climate, you know what the temperature was doing every single year for this whole time. There's samples of the ancient atmosphere trapped in bubbles in the ice. And it's these bubbles that allow us to know how much carbon dioxide there was in the atmosphere in the past, for example, and to ask questions like, did carbon dioxide and temperature change at the same time in the past? How important is carbon dioxide to changing climate? And all of these things. And the answer to those questions is basically, yes, carbon dioxide does change when climate changes, and carbon dioxide is important for the Earth's climate.
A slightly warmer global average temperature is not likely to take out any species to affect maybe one human life. But that's simply the shorthand for climate disruption, or as people are increasingly saying, climate shock. This is not something benign, because it won't come just gradually as a 1/10 of a degree warmer this year than last year. As we know, it comes in a pattern which can be very disruptive.
We also know that the more we provoke the climate system, the more rapidly we send these heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere, the greater the possibility that some regions of the world will see some rather abrupt cooling. Not so abrupt as depicted in The Day After Tomorrow, but perhaps on the order of what we've seen in the record of something on the order of a decade, which is quite rapid.
Ice and snow will cover the entire northern hemisphere. The ice and snow will reflect sunlight. The Earth's atmosphere will restabilize, but with an average temperature close to that of the last ice age.
People think that global warming means that everything is going to get warmer, which would be logical since that's what the words mean. But it actually, probably a better term to use to describe what's happening in our world is climate change. Because as the average global temperatures go up and as we add CO2 to the atmosphere, some places are going to get warmer, some places are going to get cooler. What scientists sort of agree on is that you're going to see more extremes, more drought, more desertification in some places, wetter, heavier rainfall in other places.
These little bubbles here are trapped pieces of air that are 10,000 years old. So these little tiny pieces of air represent, what our ancestors were breathing. We know from these bubbles that atmospheric methane concentration shot up at the end of the last ice age. And what we think that means is that the planet got much wetter in some places and drier in other places. And then 8,000 years ago, the methane dropped at the same time that Greenland cooled, all within 10 years of each other. And what this means is that a lot of the world dried out. And so that if that were to happen again today, there'd be widespread drought. That's really the most likely way that we humans will feel a climate event like this. It's not through a tidal wave hitting New York City, or certainly not ice in New York City, but more likely through drought in some places and flooding in other places.
But it is true we're seeing also, for example, more intense rainfall, so that when it rains, more water is coming down. And that is a perfectly logical consequence of putting more heat into our system, into our climate system. More heat means more energy, means more evaporation of water off the land, and that water goes up, it has to come down, and you get more of it in rainfall. So that we're seeing increased intensity of rainfall, not necessarily more, it's not necessarily raining more often, but when it rains harder. So when we see the floods in the Midwest that we've seen in the last decade or so, that again is another sort of harbinger of what's going to happen in the future.
Changing the temperature of the Earth changes all climates. It warms the centers of the continents, for instance, which, when warmed, dry out. And we're watching at the moment the drying out of Central Asia. We have a big drought in Arizona, elsewhere, and everyone has noticed that the forests of North America are burning. They're burning because it's warmer and drier.
We had 255,000 hectares of fires last year, but they were the most intense fires that British Columbia has seen, and when they took off, there was nothing anyone could do to stop them. We lost 300 and some homes, we lost businesses, we had an entire town, the town of Lewis Creek, wiped out. We had to evacuate 50,000 people, which is the second largest evacuation in the history of Canada.
The same thing is happening all across Asia. I'm told that 13 million hectares of forests in Russia burned this past summer. These are big, serious problems. The climatic disruption has the potential for literally burning civilization off the Earth in the course of the next decades.
Where rain falls and where it doesn't has tremendous impact on civilization. The intensification of droughts and floods will pose tremendous problems for society.
In the Okanagan area, where we had the worst of these fires, we had a large sudden rainfall. It was a 1 in 80-year rainfall following this 1 in 100-year drought. The rains caused flash floods. We had mudslides going through the community. People who thought they'd seen hell saw worse. And so the consequences of these climatic extremes, these climatic anomalies of extreme dryness, of warm winters, are devastating our ecosystems, and they're destroying our soil, and the siltation is destroying the salmon streams in the area.
Everything in the world is so interconnected that if you go grab one piece of it and pull it out or do something to it, you can bet there will be repercussions that we don't even know now. I mean, sure, the salmon might cease to exist in 50 years in the Pacific Northwest, but all the ramifications of that. Well, look, who would have thought that if you melt the snow a month earlier in the western United States, that would lead to, virtually fatal water problems? You wouldn't have thought that if I just told you that. You would never guess that. But the system is set up in such a way as to make use of that. The worst mistake we can make is to assume that the future will be as it has been.
The snow is melting, the ice is melting. People in California, Oregon, Washington that depend on the snowpack in the Cascades, in the Sierras, in the middle of this century, unless we begin to act today, they're going to see that snowpack disappearing and their water supply and their energy supply is declining dramatically.
The bottom line is that the greenhouse warming will cause changes in the water cycle in such a way as to put serious stress on the western United States as we know it within 25 to 50 years. And the stress will show up as just simply lack of water.
It's appearing now in the form of forest fires and drought and various other changes, spread of disease, plant diseases as well as animal diseases.
We've got, for instance, winters where we no longer have 40 degrees below, and as a consequence, we haven't had that for the past 8 years. As a consequence, the pine bark beetle, whose population is normally succumbing, about 80% of the population succumbs to the extreme cold. That population's gone into a superpopulation, and it is at this stage infested 4 million hectares. That's 10 million acres of pine which are dead or dying, and the population is in such a state, even if we had a cold winter like we typically have, the remaining, we're at even only 5%, would still keep spreading. There'd be more beetles than we have pine left, and we expect all of the pine in British Columbia to be destroyed by the beetle over the next few years.
Virtually everywhere we look, we see the greenhouse signal predicted by the current climate models, not just in the surface temperature, but in the sea ice, the way it's changed, snow cover, the way it's changed, most importantly in the heat content of the oceans. They're an integrator of long-term change. And it turns out that's where most of the greenhouse warming has gone, into warming up the oceans.
One of the most certain effects of climate change or global warming is that sea level is going to rise. And a lot of people are confused about that. It's not going to rise so much because glaciers are melting or the polar ice cap, particularly in Antarctica, is going to melt, which if it did would contribute a lot to it. But a lot of the rise is going to come about simply because as water warms, it expands. So as all the oceans warm up and that water expands, they have to go somewhere. It's going to go up.
Now, it would be simple if the sea level rise came by itself, but it comes with things like storm surges, and it comes with things like tidal change, and it comes with additional consequences that exacerbate some of those smaller shifts.
One of the things we're seeing in the ocean is a changing pattern of the salinity. We're finding that the tropics are getting saltier, and the high latitude ocean, especially in the North Atlantic, is getting fresher. And this is dramatic new evidence for man's impact on the global climate system.
Our climate is stabilized to a certain extent by a heat exchange between the tropics and the Arctic. The ocean currents, in particular the North Atlantic currents, work to bring heat to the northern hemisphere.
Heat from the sun arrives at the equator and is carried north by the ocean. But global warming is melting the polar ice caps and disrupting this flow.
Essentially, the hypothesis in this film, which is a real hypothesis, is that we will be messing up something called the ocean conveyor, which brings warm water from the equator, from areas around the equator, up to the north in the Gulf Stream. And it's water that's more saline, it's saltier. When it gets up into the North Atlantic, it sinks and it forms a conveyor belt that brings warm energy and warm air and moisture northward, cools, and then brings it back down the equator in this sort of conveyor belt thing.
And the amount of heat that is left behind by this ocean circulation is staggering. It amounts to the output of about 500,000 large power stations and has a profound effect on the climate for those regions bordering the North Atlantic, including northwestern Europe and the eastern seaboard of the United States and Canada.
As we warm the planet, and as we add more fresh water from the melting of sea ice, perhaps from increased rainfall, perhaps from some melting in the polar region, as we add more fresh water into this warm, salty water that's coming up from the tropics, we increase its density. It becomes colder, and it has a tendency to sink. So as that sinks, if we don't have that big pull coming up, there's some possibility, there's some information in the scientific community that leads us to suspect that this North Atlantic heat pump may weaken and perhaps stop.
The likelihood that it would stop is probably very low, but you don't have to stop it. You simply need to slow it down.
Now we are discovering changes, ongoing changes in the ocean, just in the past couple of years, that suggest that we might be heading towards this type of phenomena, that is a shutdown of the conveyor that would tend to cool off Europe and North America.
If a change happens in the North Atlantic region, it can be felt within a year in the tropics. It can change tropical rainfall in ways that are unimaginable according to our previous understanding. So I think the most valuable thing we're getting from studying the past is that the system is more sensitive than we thought.
We don't know how the climate system will react to an ice-free Arctic, to a very fresh North Atlantic that perhaps has lost its conveyor system. We just don't understand enough about the climate system to say what will happen, how growing seasons will change, what areas will still support agriculture, what areas won't.
Agriculture has been adjusted and adapted to the particular climate conditions in each place. And so when climate changes, it almost doesn't matter if it's wetter or drier, it's going to be a problem for farmers.
If you changed the weather regime of Europe without dramatic extreme weather events, but just changed soil moisture and the ability to grow crops there, it would have devastating global financial consequences, consequences on global food production.
London, Edinburgh, most of Northern Europe freezes up in the wintertime, and where do all those people go? You have all of that investment in Northern Europe, and where is that going to head, and how does that impact in the dynamics of the rest of the world?
Just half an hour ago, Mexican officials closed the border in the light of so many U.S. refugees who are fleeing south.
In human history over the last 10,000 years, most conflicts have been triggered by a collapse of ecosystems around a society, i.e. the inability to support them either from ecological reasons or resource reasons, lack of fuel, lack of food, lack of water, and what those societies do is they raid their neighbors.
Water is an explosive issue in the Middle East. The Middle East is already a political powder keg. If the climate regime were to change dramatically and the distribution and availability of fresh water were to change in the Middle East, it's not hard to imagine that that could provoke what is already a very, very difficult situation.
We're going to see many of the arid and semi-arid areas around the world become even drier. We're going to see agricultural production decrease, especially in the tropics and subtropics, exactly where there's hungry people today. We're going to see the sea level increase, potentially displacing tens of millions of people in small island states and low-lying deltaic areas such as Bangladesh, Egypt and China.
How do we deal with millions of boat people? How do we deal with interventions around the world? I mean, just imagine what will happen when 160 million Bangladeshis have to move, and the places they go are India, China, and Burma. That's going to be a big mess.
There are people on the front lines that we've been to their communities in our ships, and they're telling us the changes are now. We can verify what your scientists are saying, but it's even worse than what your scientists know.
And then there's other kinds of impacts. Let's take another one, which we begin to see already in the system, disease vectors, which is the way of, in scientific jargon, describing where diseases move and how they get around. One of the common ones that we know a fair amount about is malaria. Find it very commonly in the south and the tropics, and everyone advises you to take your shots before you go down there, because if you get bitten by a malaria-carrying mosquito, then you'll get very sick, and it's really rather unpleasant. We've begun now to see malaria-carrying mosquitoes moving up into Florida and into the United States. There's no abrupt change here. It's just that the habitat for these particular bugs and this disease has expanded because things are just slightly warmer and the wetness that they required is available. And that's projected to move northward. That's projected to move into new areas that they didn't used to exist in. And the warmer it gets, and with these kinds of changes in soil moisture and precipitation, that continues.
So while we've got to solve global warming, both by reducing the amount of fossil fuels that we burn, we also need to protect the ecosystems that regulate the climate system of the planet. And that's a major role for both the oceans and for the ancient forests. There's 7 magnificent forests, as we call them, left, 7 ancient forests around the world, and we have spent a lot of time at Greenpeace protecting the Amazon in Brazil. And it's these ancient trees that many have called the lungs of the planet that regulate the greenhouse gases in our atmosphere and help keep the global climate as hospitable as it has been to enable our population to grow to the size that it has become. Trees take on carbon dioxide and they use the carbon to build the woody tissue. When we burn an excessive amount of fossil fuels, we throw an amount of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that the planet hasn't seen since the age of the dinosaurs. The ancient forests do their best to absorb this. They can even increase their rate of growth. They're overwhelmed by this, however. Then, to make matters worse, when these forests are cut down, all the carbon that has been absorbed into these forests, the trees, the branches, the leaves, and the soil, is released into the atmosphere, magnifying the problem and eliminating one of the great sinks for this carbon dioxide to be absorbed into. So these problems are directly linked, both the burning of fossil fuels and the necessity for these healthy forests to be absorbing at least some of that carbon dioxide that we throw off.
The Earth's climate has already changed, and some further change is inevitable, independent of how much we try and limit our greenhouse gas emissions. We should limit greenhouse gas emissions to minimise the change, but some change is inevitable. That means we're going to have to learn not only how to limit greenhouse gas emissions, but also how we're going to adapt to a changing climate. More extreme weather events, more heat waves, more floods, more droughts, more climate variability. How can we grow the food we need in a warmer world, and in some places a drier world and some places a wet world? How can we manage an increase in vector-borne diseases such as dengue and malaria? How can we manage sea level rise with greater storm surges? How can we live in a world where biodiversity is threatened and many of our ecosystems are also threatened?
You know, traditionally, Americans, maybe all people, wait until something spectacular happens before they respond. Probably September 11th is the biggest example of that. Unfortunately, with climate change, there really isn't, once you've had a road accident, once you've had something that really is spectacularly bad go wrong, it's probably too late for us to do anything about it. If we see evidence that the climate has begun to shift abruptly, by that time there won't be a lot we can do except sort of put band-aids on the problem and try and hunker down and get ready for what's coming, because it won't be a matter of trying to conserve fossil fuels at that point. It'll be a matter of trying to manage the resources to support the existing populations that are there and get ready for the refugees that will be created by the problem.
The US is about 5% of the world's population, and we emit about 25% of all greenhouse gases. If the rest of the world wanted the same per capita emissions as the United States, it would be a totally uninhabitable planet.
So we are, both historically and currently and projected into the future, a very significant contributor to the problem.
China, India, and the United States all are very heavily reliant on coal. And in China and India, they're just starting to be rich enough to be able to purchase cars, so you're having really rapid motorization.
We currently use 20 times more energy, CO2 emissions, than the average person in India, 10 times more than the average person in China. If they were to use the amounts of CO2 that we emit, the Earth's climate would be many, many tens of degrees warmer than it currently is.
The big hope is that there'll be enough economic growth in places like China or India so that they'll kind of leapfrog over our coal-based technology, or our carbon-based technology, we might call it, and go to renewable energy or go to hydrogen as a source of fuel in the future. But that actually is not the pattern that is happening. And if you look at it pretty carefully, they're following our path.
China is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. But they're a developing country. There are still 200 million people living in China living on less than $1 a day. And to go to China and say, you need to be doing more to reduce your emissions, when the United States is not doing that, politically it's just a non-starter.
And so there is a real issue of how do we proceed? And the answer is, industrialized countries should start taking steps now to decarbonize their energy systems, use the energy we produce much more efficiently, manage our land resources much more effectively, and then as we start to take those steps in the industrialized world, we need to find ways to work with India, China, and other developing countries so that they can also be part of the compact.
Global warming has made the world smaller than even airplane travel. The Europeans are measuring air pollution that is blowing across the Atlantic from the US. The US, people here in the US, are breathing air pollution that's coming from China. So for the first time in human history, we're challenged with all surviving together, or it's doomsday alone.
This is not a question that any one country can solve. The world's largest emitter is the United States, and it is a much bigger emitter than the number 2 player. But we're only responsible for about 20% of the collective emissions. That's a big number, but 80% has to happen someplace else. Unless you get some kind of an interactive, large-scale international program, you can't solve the problem. So the internationalism of the whole issue, I think, is evident.
In 1992, the nations of the world got together and said, climate change is a problem and we should do something about it. And the developed world was supposed to take various actions and try to get their emissions in the year 2000 to be at 1990 levels. Well, it was pretty clear by the mid-1990s that most countries, including, of course, the United States, were not on that path. We were going to vastly exceed that.
This wonderful work that was done at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 has largely gone unimplemented during the years. And the treaties that were signed there, including the Climate Treaty, which the U.S. signed and ratified subsequently in the Senate, we're still trying to get one implementing agreement to come out of that treaty.
So there was a global effort to try to design a system that would require emission reductions first in the developed world, and it sort of culminated in what has been called the Kyoto Protocol, which was negotiated in 1997 and which hasn't yet come into effect, in large part because the United States decided it didn't want to do it.
And the U.S. is opposing it, and the U.S. is probably working to keep Russia from signing it also. There's certainly many stories to that effect.
For a long, long time, the U.S. has been the leader. I mean, I chaired U.S. delegations around the world when I was at the State Department, and it was thrilling. Now, you'd go into a room, go into a negotiation, people would sort of stop. What does the United States want to do? Because we not only had the expertise and the technical capability, right, but we had kind of the moral principle, and we were the leaders on, issues that were human rights issues, environmental issues on proliferation. We were the leader around the world. We got to get ourselves back in that position again.
We don't believe that the world superpower can remain on the outside of world opinion and in the face of this global threat. This threat is something that is probably worse than terrorism. This is something the United States must face up to in due course.
So we're left in a very funny situation globally. You've got countries in Europe still committed to the reductions required by that protocol, which they've gone ahead and ratified. You've got the United States and Australia, and at the moment Russia, not moving forward there, and a lot of disarray.
So Europe is moving quite strongly ahead. They've put in taxes on carbon. They've gone to a market for emissions trading to allow a cap and then using the market to make choices about where least cost reductions can occur. They've gone for some efficiency programs, both at the micro level by standardizing and requiring appliances to meet certain standards about how efficient they are, and at a larger level by trying to develop new motor technologies that use less electricity for the same output delivered.
Companies that take action on environmental issues in Europe as a result of public awareness, they get credit for doing that. And their shareholders expect that. There's an expectation of that. If you're operating in a system where the only reward is based on whether or not you meet earnings, and there's no mechanism to get credit for doing good, right? Then there's a disincentive to do good. And that disincentive unfortunately is pervasive in the United States, where in Europe, companies feel that if they take action on environmental issues like climate change, their employees will be happier. Their stakeholders, people who put pressure on them, will be happier. Their share price will go up.
So if you look at a company like BP, for example, which went so far as to change their name from British Petroleum to Beyond Petroleum, they're staking out a pretty clear message. Their scientists on their staff early on acknowledged climate change is a problem and looked at their CEO and said, hey, we produce a lot of carbon emissions, we better figure out some other future, and they are in the process of doing that. Other companies have dragged their feet and sort of put up the wall and said, we're not going to change until we're absolutely told to do so.
I think the real conflict is between what we might think of as market fundamentalism, which basically says that the market can do no wrong, that we just let the free market operate and somehow it will magically solve all of our problems, and those who recognize that that position really deprives us of our civic responsibility to put human values, to put social values, to put environmental values into the economy. Because the truth is that the market doesn't give a fig about the environment. It doesn't give a fig about social issues and it doesn't, in many times, it doesn't give a fig about jobs. And if we want to protect Americans in their livelihoods, in our environment, in our communities, we've got to put civic values into the marketplace, and that requires government.
Our history in the United States is until
an industry is mandated, they're not going to necessarily rise to the occasion or rise to the true challenge that's before them. Certainly, we can go back and, seatbelts. The auto industry fought that right to the end, and obviously it was a good idea. And even though one of the arguments was seatbelts and airbags were cost prohibitive, once we had to come through, then they found a reasonable and cheap way to put seatbelts and airbags into cars.
We've seen technologies move in and out of the system quickly in some cases. It requires a big shock. The United States switched very, very rapidly away from oil-powered generation for electricity. How do you create your electricity? For a long time we did it for oil, and we switched very quickly after the oil shocks of the 1970s. That was a pretty big shock, and we moved fast. We also all have adopted portable laptops, and we now all have cell phones, and those came quickly into the market. We don't have the same urgency for this problem that drives it. On the one hand, there's no big cost that's pushing it there, which is what oil did, nor is there a major convenience which is pushing it there, which is what laptops gave us and cell phones gave us. So we're stuck with the need for policy without the urgency.
Corporate America at the moment has very much a short-term focus. They're focused on quarterly earnings, will they meet Wall Street expectations, and that can stifle a lot of long-term technological development. Climate change is a long-term issue. It's going to require a lot of long-term technological development.
There's nothing complicated here. If you produce coal, or you burn coal in a power plant, or if you produce oil, or you sell it to others, or if you produce automobiles and your whole economic livelihood and your firm is dependent on that, you obviously are not going to be jumping to the fore to say we're going to stop doing that because where are your profits going to go? Where are your shareholders going to go? But there are companies who have taken sort of a different path and said, okay, we recognize this is a problem. We recognize that our product mix is going to have to change, or ultimately we're going to be out of business. And we also recognize there's a way to make money off of this. And if we can get in front of the bow wave instead of behind it, perhaps there's a way it can be good for everybody, including our shareholders.
There are approximately 50 large financial institutions that have created an organization called the International Network for Climate Risk. These approximately 50 financial institutions manage between them $1.9 trillion under management. This organization has been created to put pressure on leading companies around the world to take action on climate change.
The Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility has been leading the charge with a lot of these companies to demand that they do something, or at least to investigate in their own company sort of what their liabilities are if they don't act on climate change. What could be the long-term harm to their company?
At any given moment, depending upon the stock market, we represent about $110 to $150 billion of investment assets. And we have been working for more than 30 some odd years now, raising concerns, what we would consider ethical concerns that come from our own faith traditions.
What we're urging these companies to do is to increase shareholder value by looking at energy efficiency and conservation, fuel switching, in time to do it before the crisis hits, because that's when it's going to cost you the most. If you act now, you pay less. If you wait until everybody's screaming and running around like chickens without heads, looking for the carbon credits that they'll need to offset their emissions, you're going to pay much, much more for them. Whereas if you position yourself now to develop renewable energies, to invest in what we call carbon sequestration projects, fancy name for a lot of times just reforestation projects, or carbon sinks, ways of putting the CO2 underground, encapsulating it so it doesn't escape into the atmosphere. These are the kinds of investments companies need to be making now in order to have the credits they'll need when we move to a cap-and-trade system.
One of the segments of the economy that is most interested in climate change are the insurance and reinsurance groups. They have to have a long-term focus because it's the nature of their business. They may be insuring property for 2 or 3 decades. And so it's of utmost importance to them to know what sort of weather events they may be facing in 20 or 30 years, because that's going to determine whether their business is still viable or not.
The California fires last year cost the insurance industry over $2 billion. And Munich Re says that by 2050, the insurance industry could be paying out $300 billion a year for global warming liabilities.
In Australia, the 10 largest insured losses, of the 10 in history, 8 of them are weather-related. The leader of the largest insurance company in Australia has said, climate change is the single largest issue facing my company. Climate change is going to affect the business world in 2 ways. One, growing regulation around the world, right, and expectation of stakeholders. And what if you're in the forestry business? What if there are changes in the distribution of rainfall? What if you're in the agriculture business? What if you're in any business that uses water? You know, if there are changes, wholesale changes in the climate regime, you can imagine the number of companies that may be affected by that.
The auto industry is a key industry for understanding how the economy may react to climate change pressures. And what we're seeing today is very different response from car companies on the climate change issue. Some car companies, while recognizing that climate change is a problem, have not yet made any real changes to their technologies and their vehicles to provide consumers with the sorts of vehicles that are more climate friendly, that emit fewer carbon dioxide emissions.
Every gallon of gasoline you burn in a car or an SUV or a truck produces about 20 pounds of carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere. And automobiles, SUVs, and so on contribute 20 or 25% of the carbon emissions in the United States. So they are a big piece of this difficult problem.
We're trying to get a coalition of automakers and environmentalists together to really do a major push in the United States on hybrid cars. You know, you and I can go out today and buy a Toyota Prius or a Honda that are hybrids. There are no American-made hybrids. There ought to be a lot of American-made hybrids, and there ought to be a major push to give people incentives to do this. It's very important for us to do.
Those cars that we're already seeing on the roads don't compromise performance, but allow drivers to drive as much as they have been at the moment, with as much as half of the fuel consumption. So that's a technology that some companies are bringing to market today, giving consumers a greater choice, allowing them to buy a product that has less impact on the global atmosphere, contributes less to climate change.
Another big source of emissions is the power plant sector, electricity. And we've actually seen a lot of gains in the electricity sector in recent years because we've managed to make those power plants much more efficient. And there's a lot of scope for doing more of that in the future in terms of either switching off coal, we use a lot of coal in this country, or using much more efficient coal technologies like integrated gasification combined cycle coal, which is an excellent technology, very efficient, very clean, and it gives you the option of capturing and sequestering carbon during the process, so it could actually be a carbon-free technology. And these have been demonstrated and are technically viable, and we need to start moving them into commercialization.
People may have seen wind turbines and solar panels. And these are technologies which over time could replace coal-fired power stations, gas-fired power stations, and allow people to derive electricity but without the carbon dioxide emissions that deriving electricity from fossil fuels brings.
I believe, and most of these companies believe, that you need a program that requires everybody to do things, that levels the playing field. It makes for better competition, and it actually ensures that you get a result, because everybody starts working toward the same end. And that's why we need legislation.
There are a lot of positive efforts going on right now in Washington, including McCain-Lieberman, and that's a great first step into doing something about climate change in the United States.
Well, from one practical side, we made it as modest as you possibly can in order to reduce the amount of criticism that we would get. Now, the opponents have already described it as the end of Western civilization as we know it, but the reality is we tried to make it a very modest proposal which had economic benefits associated with it so that we could garner the most votes.
What it will do is to get the Congress on record as acknowledging that there is a problem.
And that is a constructive step. But we've got to take much bigger steps, much bigger steps.
When the first bill that would actually reduce emissions came up for a vote in the Senate, there actually were Republicans who voted for it. So it's becoming less of sort of a Democrats' issue. A bill was just introduced in the House by 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats.
You know, you think about a lot of the major environmental legislation that was on clean water, and the National Environmental Protection Act happened under Richard Nixon was president. So, I mean, this has not historically not been a partisan issue. There's been tremendous agreement on this front, a great bipartisan activity until very recently.
This cuts across parties, Republican, Democrat, Independent. The fact is the people see that something bad is happening and they want their government to take the leadership. Unfortunately, what happens in Washington is that the special interests that'll have to change to deal with climate change don't want to change. So they put pressure on. But they're on the losing side of history.
There are a lot of moneyed interests in this country that would prefer not to have to change. I mean, that's a simple fact that a lot of the big coal, oil, and gas companies are headquartered in this country, and most of them are not interested in having to make a major shift in their businesses.
Do not underestimate the influence of the lobbyists here in Washington and the special interest. I don't know how to explain it any other way. And it doesn't take much to gridlock the legislative process, particularly here in the Senate. And they've been able to do that.
If you're an oil executive, if you're an elected official in Washington, if you say that there's no clear evidence yet that human activity, the burning of fossil fuel, is causing the climate to change, if you make that statement, it's an obscene statement, and it is an absurd statement.
The opponents of our legislation and any other effort to deal with global warming always try to pose it as a choice between a better environment and jobs. This is false. It's a false choice. The reality is that if you begin to do something about global warming, not only are we going to protect the environment and people's health, we're actually going to do better for the economy, and we're going to create more jobs.
If you want good jobs, the idea that we move in a much more environmentally sound way is the only way you're going to create good jobs. Human infrastructure at this point in time must, not should, must be compatible with nature's infrastructure.
There's going to be a lot of interest in the film The Day After Tomorrow, which is science fiction. But when it comes to global warming, the film is not the only science fiction around. There's a lot of science fiction being spread by people who don't want us to do anything. Again, by the special interests who don't want to change. I suppose you could always find a scientist to give you the opinion you want, but the prevailing scientific opinion and all of our experience is that global warming is real. It's being caused by people, and therefore we're the ones who have to solve it. And we can if we're ready to lead.
This issue is very complicated. It is technically complicated in a scientific context, and there are many uncertainties. So it's very easy for those who are interested in prolonging the fossil fuel age to point to the uncertainties that reign throughout all of this science and say, well, because it's uncertain, we shouldn't take any steps that would inhibit the use of fossil fuels and run the risk of being costly. That's absurd.
There are some people who would prefer to highlight uncertainties because they view inaction as a preferable option for whatever political motivation they may have. I think the job of the scientific community is to state the facts, to state what we know, what we don't know, where there's legitimate uncertainty, what we can find out in a reasonable period of time with investments in research, and what may still be unknowable.
Part of our campaign, and indeed campaigns by a number of environmental groups and others, has been to get industry to come clean about the junk science that they're funding. Science is supposed to be peer-reviewed. It's supposed to be neutral exploration, attempt to find the facts. But what we were getting from corporate America was the kind of science that the tobacco industry was funding to say, well, there's nothing wrong with tobacco, it's not addictive, and it's not a problem.
I think it would be nice if Congress would discipline itself and only listen to science that has been peer-reviewed, things that are published in the open literature and reviewed by by other scientists and validated by the scientific community.
It is rarely a case that on any piece of science there's as much consensus over that piece of fact, as there is on this issue.
In many ways, we think the science has now been abused and manipulated. I think some would say censored, and that when the government's own scientists have come out with reports showing concern over climate change, demonstrating consensus within the scientific research community, there have been some instances where that has been left out of reports or it has been otherwise edited, and I think that's a really bad direction to go in.
This administration, the Bush administration, wasn't sure if they trusted the International Planet on Climate Change scientists. So he brought a group of American scientists together. They went through all the data, and about 3 years ago, those scientists concluded that yes, human activity, the burning of fossil fuel, a whole range of other industrial activities is increasing CO2 at an accelerated rate that the planet cannot absorb, so we're changing the climate.
That group of scientists, of course, was the National Academy of Science.
Right.
Our most prestigious scientists in this country.
Our government has to operate in an open way, contend with all of basic science, and address the public's interest, the public good. That's the purpose of government. It's the whole purpose of government, and there isn't any other purpose.
It's disgraceful that they would block you from interviewing anyone, but the Admiral Lautenbach, in his testimony before my committee said if you're worried about global warming, or climate change, you should go to sleep for 30 years. So it's pretty clear what NOAA thinks about climate change, and it's really unfortunate.
I remember when I first began working at the State Department as a science advisor, we had an interesting conversation about the differences between the policy community and the science community. The policy community works with what is known and seeks to reach consensus on how to move on that basis. The science community doesn't care as much about what is known, they care about what is not yet known. And they are always seeking to push the edges of what's known, and they focus on uncertainty and on new problems, and they talk right past each other.
Scientific community is fundamentally conservative, and there are always scientists who are so conservative that they think that scientists really should not participate in public affairs.
I have a feeling that scientists, and I was a scientist, and in an earlier age I might have just laid out the science and said, okay, somebody else can do with this. But this is an issue that is far too important for the world as a whole for scientists to simply say, we're going to put out this information and let whoever wants to use it, whatever way they decide politically or by persuasion or whatever, should go. They have to take their own role in persuasion and in educating the public, and many of them are certainly doing so.
If we don't try and address climate change, our children and grandchildren are going to look back on us and say, boy, was that a greedy society. They exploited cheap energy for short-term economic profit, not caring what world they left behind.
We've had 25 years of basically fiddling while Rome burns in an almost literal way. And the people I really feel sorry for, in a sense, are the new generation represented by our students at our school at Yale. I mean, they are the ones who, will suffer the most, the new generation, from my generation's 25-year neglect of this very serious issue.
There's a lot of interest in running for office and a lot of interest in getting involved with the political process in a way that I think is really important, because I think if we can't change the politicians' minds right now who are in office about the environment, we need to become the politicians who are in office and really make the policy that's going to make a difference. And I think that we're not afraid to do that.
Well, I actually think about it in terms of what I pass on to my children and future generations. And I want to know that my children can actually see a glacier, see red maples in the northeast, and I know that they predict by the year 2070 that the glaciers in Glacial National Park will disappear, and I want to know that when my grandchildren come into this world, that they won't look back and say, why didn't my ancestors do anything? Why didn't my grandmother do anything to stop this?
I give a lot of talks on this subject to audiences because, as I said, it's part of my job here is to try to educate. And inevitably, there'll be somebody stand up and say, well, this is a problem for the future. Why should we worry about this now? It's generally a gray hair like me. And, it used to really bother me. Now I just ask them 2 questions. Do you have any children? Most times they'll say yes. I said, do you have any grandchildren? Yes, we do have grandchildren. I said, you're creating for them, or we are creating for them now, the world that they're going to have to live in. And you know what? If they don't like it, there's not a goddamn thing they can do about it. We've done it. So if you don't care about your kids, or you really don't care about your grandkids, then I think you ought to ignore this problem. Boy, the room gets real quiet.
After looking at this problem for almost 23 years now, I think the biggest problem is that most people don't make the link between this problem and their daily lives. So when I had an opportunity to work with the film, I thought, wow, this is fantastic. Enormously successful commercial film that's going to be seen by people all over the world. Even if they leave the film and simply say, there is a link between my life and this problem, if I could be a part of that, that would be fantastic.
We felt that when we were making the film, we sort of looked at ourselves and said, well, we've got all these trucks and we've got all these generators and there are all these people, and the fact is that we do burn fossil fuels and we do create pollution and we do put carbon emissions into the atmosphere, and you really can't make a movie without doing that. And so the idea of making the film carbon neutral, where we would basically plant trees and through the organization Future Forests, bring the total to zero, basically put back into the environment what we have taken out by the making of this film, was something that we felt was the right thing to do.
This is probably the world's first large commercial film that is climate friendly.
This movie gets released by Fox, and Fox is owned by Rupert Murdoch. And he has a certain political agenda, and I'm actually really proud that I did this movie for Murdoch, because it's a very subversive movie. And I always said, the movie doesn't have to be political at all. It only has to tell the facts.
There was a battle for 10 or 15 years about whether this is even a problem. And I think we've begun to emerge from that debate as the scientific consensus has strengthened, as the data has improved. To now, we're really beginning to debate finally what to do about it, and who should do what should the United States do relative to the rest of the world, what's the role of China, India, the European Union, etc. at one level. At a second level, what should we be doing here in the United States? What's the role of business? What's the role of government? And at a third level, what's the role of communities and individuals? And it's a pretty big problem. It's going to take many years to solve it, and everybody has to play a role.
By taking concerted actions to reduce our emissions, to wean ourselves from the reliance on fossil fuels, to slow the release of carbon dioxide that comes through the clearing of forests, we have the capacity to reduce the worst impacts and to set ourselves up for a society in the next 50, 100 years that we'll want our children and grandchildren to inherit.
And we can do it. It won't be the same world with different equipment. It'll be a different world, be a new world. But the world is new almost every day anyway. And we'd much rather have a new world with that sort of thing going on than a new world in which starvation is spreading around the world because we've eroded the environment out from under us.
Something is happening out there. We have numerous cities, including our own city of New Haven, setting goals for renewable energy. Cities across the country, states across the country, 26 states have some measure that would deal with the problem of climate change, either enacted or about to be enacted. People are active. It is sinking into people that this is a serious issue. And I think what is needed now, yes, it would be ideal to have political leadership in Washington. That would put it over the top. The president getting on the television and saying, we've got to do something. Let's come together, country, and do it. But absent that, let's work at the state level, let's work at the city level, let's work in our communities, in our own decisions. We've waited on the politicians long enough, and it's time for people to take charge. It's time for people to take the helm. There are enough people in this country, I think, that are beginning to care about this issue to make a difference.